What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some games I've been avoiding, frankly, for one reason or another, but as I'm going to lay out in this video, I'm hoping to get around to them relatively soon, and given all the year-end talk about everything I have covered, I thought it might be interesting to go over some games I have not covered, pretty deliberately, and why that is. Though most of these are not really from this year at all. But to begin with a much more broad statement about it, it's pretty easy to fill a list like this with games I never had any intention of playing at all, and I've actually made videos about that, talking about genres of games I don't particularly enjoy. As an easy example, fighting games aren't really my jam, and so it'd be pretty easy to just put 5 fighting games on here and call it a day, but obviously that would be kind of silly. So it's more that these games are games that I'm interested in that would actually fit in on the channel, but for one reason or another I have not covered them yet, and while we're going to go into the specific reasons for each of them, very broadly, what I do in reviewing all of these games requires a lot of planning ahead of time. Generally, right at the beginning of the year, as I'm going to here soon, I get a working list going of every old and new releasing game that year that I want to take a look at so I can start planning and kind of moving that stuff around in a way to essentially always be working on something and putting out content for it. And while I would say that works pretty well, reality is it also comes with a few problems here and there for games that are harder to fit into that schedule and or formula. Sometimes these are games that are just hard to kind of mold into the way I like to review games, so I have to take a somewhat unique approach to them, and that kind of takes its own bit of time and planning in and of itself. Other times, the games are just extremely long, and I know it's going to take a long time to actually do everything and give that game the time and attention that it deserves to create a review that is actually representative of what that game is. And then I have to weigh that time against other things I could potentially be doing, but at this point, having reviewed so many games and covered so many older ones and even larger titles, the sort of cost-benefit of that is easier to parse through. But with all of that stuff said and out of the way, let's actually talk about some of these games and why I've been avoiding them and hopefully how I'll cover them in the future. So first up, we have Battle Brothers. This is a game people have requested me to cover constantly. It is a TRPG, a tactical RPG, putting you in control of a band of mercenaries working their way through a low fantasy medieval world. And the entire game is just about the journey that happens to take you on. Individual mercenary companies will eventually retire, and then presumably you'll be on to the next one. Since its release in 2017, it has gotten a great deal of love, several DLCs, etc. And as somebody who covers a lot of TRPGs, this one naturally comes up a lot. So the reason I haven't covered this one and why I've been avoiding it is relatively straightforward, as seeing and doing everything this game has to offer is just incredibly time consuming, not least of which because several of the game's mechanisms don't come into play until later on in a playthrough, such as the late game crises that can happen, which are various situations your mercenaries can get involved in, such as a holy war, an undead scourge, an orc invasion, etc. And it usually takes to the tune of like 100 to 200 hours I've seen to actually go through and get all of that stuff. So put simply, Battle Brothers, if you want to see everything and do everything in the context of a review, is a massive undertaking. And it's been difficult to justify the time investment, especially with how busy I've been with other things and other releases, etc. So that's pretty much why. Hopefully here soon, though, I'll actually be able to make some time for it and suffer my way through the game's myriad of setbacks to hopefully come out triumphant at the other end. But speaking of large time investments in TRPGs, we then of course have XCOM 1 and 2, a notable absence from a channel that covers a lot of tactical RPGs as well as XCOM 1 and 2. The remakes, to be a little more specific, have had an enormous amount of influence on pretty much every modern tactical RPG, so the fact that they aren't on the channel is a glaring omission to be sure. Now, unlike Battle Brothers, however, these are games I have played before. I am familiar with both of them. And in this case, it's actually that familiarity that tells me exactly what I'm getting into when I move to finally review those. And for both the first and second game, that comes with a few unique challenges. For starters, again, pretty significant time investment. Though in this case, with as long as those games have been out, there are plenty of step-by-step guides to handle some of the harder things. Though even then, you still have to actually go do them. But notably, things like their multiplayer that was in there at one point are no longer set up and working properly, so you have to switch to a beta branch and then jump through some hoops to get the single multiplayer achievement that game has. And needless to say, even knowing all that ahead of time, it's simply a big undertaking, and that is coupled with a few other things. For starters, a game I've already played, but not only have I played these games, I've also played a substantial amount of variants of these games, and what I mean by that is that XCOM 1 and 2 were so influential on TRPGs that a lot of other ones since then have just straight up more or less copied the basic structure of their combat systems, which means I have to play a game that I've not only played before, but also seen easily more than a dozen variants of the combat system that it uses, and honestly, I'm just a little exhausted with it. As great as those games are, and they are great, it can just get a little exhausting when every game in that genre has more or less the same combat system, and it can be hard to squeeze this one in because I usually try to mix up the games I play and not play too many of the same kind back to back because it gets a little boring, and it's hard to do that with XCOM 1 and 2 when every other TRPG is still more or less copying their homework. And because of that, I've been very slow to getting around to this one. But nonetheless, as mentioned, it's a huge glaring omission on my list of reviews to be sure, and for that reason, it's one of those things I need to power through at some point, which once I actually start will be easier to do because, again, they are great games. But that does bring us to our third entry, which is Final Fantasy XII, which might be an interesting one on this list because if you watch the channel much, you probably know that Final Fantasy XII is actually one of my favorite games of all time. So how could I possibly be avoiding it? Well, in particular, while I am extremely familiar with Final Fantasy XII, I have not actually played the remastered version, the Zodiac Age. It makes a host of changes to it, of course, making it a bit more accessible in general, not least of which is actually changes to a fight, which has actually been the single thing preventing me from jumping back into this game to actually do a review of it, because this boss was such a giant pain. And the boss is none other than, I believe it's pronounced Yasmat, who is actually the super boss of Final Fantasy XII, which you may or may not have heard of. It's a bit notorious as far as super bosses go, with an outrageous 50 million health pool. And in the Zodiac Age, it actually comes with a trial mode where you can fight staged battles, and Yasmat is in that trial mode, though in that version it has less than a tenth of the actual version's health. And to put that in perspective for you, an average clear time for this boss is 2 to 3 hours. It's been a little while, so excuse me if my information's a little out of date, but the last time I looked at it, the quickest versions of this fight that could be done were a little under an hour using the extremely optimized setups. So it's not impossible to do this fight by any means, it's just a lot. And when I think about finally getting around to reviewing Final Fantasy XII, which I am absolutely going to do one way or the other, the first thing that pops into my mind is that boss fight, which is just ever so slightly ahead of another annoying boss fight with Zodiark, I believe he's called, which is one of the final summons you'll be able to get. And that fight is especially annoying because he has an alternating physical and magical immunity that switches back and forth and causes you to have to, of course, switch up your approach and stuff. So literally just knowing that fight is ahead of me has been enough for me to put this game off for a very long time. But nonetheless, it is a game I will absolutely be reviewing at some point. Again, one of my favorite games of all time, and I really want to check out that remaster that is not by any means recent. I think they originally did it in 2018. So, it's time. Now, our fourth entry here is actually a whole bunch of different games, but I'm going to group them all together because this is the Gold Box CRPGs. You see, as I'm sure many of you are aware, this channel is kind of known for covering CRPGs. I'm kind of the CRPG guy at this point. So it might surprise you to know that there are CRPGs that I have in fact been avoiding. And this is mostly the Gold Box CRPGs, which is a whole host of games that tend to get lumped in together because they consist of several different series. And the reason I've been avoiding these is a little more, let's say interesting. So initially when I was going over all the CRPGs I've been wanting to when I switched to doing this full-time in 2021, these games were actually somewhat hard to play because they're very old. Most of them came out in late 1980s or early 1990s. In fact, they all pretty much predate even the Elder Scrolls Arena, the very first Elder Scrolls game. So they aren't spring chickens by any means. In fact, the engine used to make them eventually went on to spawn the first graphical MMO via Neverwinter Nights. No, not that one, the slightly older one from I believe it was 1991. Now, these days, however, you can actually buy most of them on Steam, designed to run on your PC as of, I believe, 2022. So why haven't I covered them? Well, simply put, the gold box CRPGs are like a niche within a niche. I think most people would agree that even following on from the success of Baldur's Gate 3, CRPGs are still not exactly a monolithic genre that draws in enormous numbers under the usual circumstances. And reality is, a lot of people today haven't even heard of the gold box CRPGs, so it can be hard to drum up interest in things like these, frankly. So a lot of what I've been avoiding them for was simply trying to find a way to present them in a way that would make people interested in learning about them, while also still, of course, doing them the justice they deserve, not least of which because most of them are older than I am. And coming into 2025, I think I've sort of figured out how I might like to approach it, which is to kind of lump several of them together in, like their respective series and do a sort of retrospective on the whole thing in a series sort of dedicated to looking at them specifically, as opposed to something more akin to one of my standard reviews, which would be a hard sell for those games, frankly. But I'm still workshopping it. That's kind of where I'm at with it right now, but for a long time, that's why I have not looked at those very, very old ones. But speaking of older CRPGs, I've also been avoiding Avernum. Avernum is one of the more popular series of games from Spiderweb Software, which itself is behind a whole host of CRPGs that are a bit younger than the gold box games, to be sure, though not by much originally. And those are some notable absences from my CRPG reviews as well, though I have been slowly going over those with the likes of, say, the Geneforge series. Now, Avernum has naturally been on my radar as a result of that, and the reason I was avoiding them, or the Avernum series in particular, I suppose, was largely that they keep getting remastered, and I kind of wanted to see if a remaster or a remade version of the Avernum series would pop up again, because there was the original Avernum series, and then those were remastered or remade, which is actually kind of interesting because originally when Avernum released, it was actually known by a different name, Exile, I believe it was, Exile 1, 2, and 3, and those three were remade into the original Avernum trilogy. And then those remakes got another remake of Avernum 1, 2, and 3 starting back in 2011 with Avernum Escape from the Pit, which is likely the version of it you would be playing now if you did. And I was curious to know if they would wind up doing that again, because Spiderweb Software has been going back and remastering or remaking a lot of their older games recently, which is why I was taking a look at the Geneforge series. So I kind of wanted to see what was happening here before I actually jumped into them and started playing them. But I got my answer earlier this year with the Kickstarter for Avernum 4 remake, which is something I backed over on Kickstarter. But with that information, I now have my answer and realistically would like to play the first three Avernum games, or I suppose the third iterations of the first three Avernum games, before the remake of that fourth game finally comes out. So that was why I was avoiding that one for so long and why I'm hopefully going to get around to it in 2025. But I do think that is pretty much everything for this particular video. I hope you found that interesting. I thought some of it was kind of maybe a little novel to talk about at the very least. So hopefully, with any luck, I'll be able to actually cover these games in the coming year as I continue to sort of kick things off my own personal channel bucket list, which is quickly becoming my own sort of 2025 New Year's resolution, if you will. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.